Hey everybody, this is KeepRetro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at the GKD Pixel. This is a small aluminum handheld, something I would consider to be in the micro category. Now there's a huge following for these type of handhelds. After all, they are super small and cute and very pocketable. However, when it comes to small handhelds like this, there's always going to be compromises. Sometimes it's the software or the controls or the screen. And so my goal in this video is to show you all the good and bad that comes with the GKD Pixel and whether or not it's going to be a good fit for you. So grab a snack and drink and let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, as always, we're going to start with the specs. Now, this is definitely a low-powered handheld. In fact, the CPU it's running is the same one that's been in many other GKD devices. In fact, I tested this chip on the GKD 350H, one of their older handhelds that came out back in 2019. And in terms of performance, this is going to cap out at PlayStation 1. Now, this doesn't have any internal storage, so everything will be stored on the microSD card. And the display is a 2.4-inch IPS LCD with a 240p resolution. The battery is 1300 mAh, which I found to give me about 4 hours of game time, and it weighs just over 100 grams. In terms of connectivity, we have a 3.5mm headphone jack and then a USB-C port for charging. And by default, the stock operating system is Linux-based called IUX. And then finally, the only other thing worth noting is that it has a mono speaker. Now, as of right now, the only place to buy this outside of China is through KeepRetro.com. And this site is a third-party retailer, and the unit that I'm reviewing today came from them. But as always, all opinions are my own, and they're not seeing this video ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. Now, the device comes in 5 different colors, and I think they mostly look pretty good, but I'm not really sold on that purple one. And in terms of pricing, I think this is at the premium level. It's $90 right now, but after speaking with the retailer, they did offer a $10 coupon code. You just have to use the code PIXEL when you check out. Now, I'm not sure how long this code is going to last, but I will leave it down in the video description if you do want to check it out. Now, let's move over to the unboxing, and I've always really liked the GKD boxes. They do a pretty good job with their design, and they're really capitalizing on the whole Pixel name right here. It has a very chunky feel to it. Inside the box, you'll get a quick instruction manual that will just walk you through some of the basics, and that is literally it. There's actually no charging cable or anything within the box. Anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at the device and give you my first impressions. And right off the bat, I think it's a great little size. It fits perfectly in my palm. The next thing I noticed is that this screen is recessed. I think that's going to prevent some scratches over time. And then finally, the third impression was that it has a very solid build quality. Obviously, it's a metal device, but I also found that it is quite sturdy. In fact, when shaking it, it doesn't really rattle that much either. And here's a quick sample. Anyway, right off the bat, I like the size, and I think it's premium and sturdy feeling. So let's go ahead and start diving into the controls. We're going to start with the D-pad. Now, this D-pad has a rubber membrane connection and has a very snappy feel to it. In fact, I would describe it as being tactile. When you press down on the button, it snaps back really quickly, to the point where you can hear the metal plastic snapping back into place. So it gives a little bit of a clacky sound to it, but I actually think it's pretty satisfying. That being said, it is a little bit on the loud side when that plastic hits the metal. Let's do a couple performance tests with this D-pad. We're going to start with the contra test. Here, I'm going to press down on the D-pad and then try to rock it left and right. And ideally, I want the character to move just a little bit. And for me, that's an indication that diagonals are possible on the D-pad, but not necessarily going to be accidental. And as far as I'm concerned, this does pass the contra test. I can move the character a little bit, and it's also pretty easy to hit the diagonals when I want to. Now let's do another test with a Capcom-style fighting game. And as you can see, it's surprisingly easy to hit both the fireballs and dragon punches, so no problems here whatsoever. And so I think they did a pretty good job with this D-pad. Not only does it pass the contra test, but it's also Hadoukenable and Shoryukenable. My only complaint is that it is relatively loud when the D-pad bounces up. And here's a quick sample. Okay, next up are the face buttons. These are also rubber membranes and also have a fair amount of travel to them. And I would say the tension of that rubber membrane is a little bit more than I would like. It's definitely not a soft button. But that being said, it's still a very satisfying experience, and these buttons are actually quieter than the D-pad. So other than the somewhat high travel and the actuation force that's required to press it down, I don't really have any complaints about these buttons either. And finally, on the front, we have our select and start buttons. Now, these are micro switches, so they're a little bit clicky, but they're relatively quiet and easy to press down on. However, However, one thing I did notice in certain games like Donkey Kong Country, when I press on the Y button to run and then the B button to jump, I found that sometimes when I pressed down with the meat of my thumb, it would actually press the start button accidentally as well. So this is something to bear in mind if you are going to be using that 2-button setup with certain games, for example with Super Mario World or Donkey Kong Country. Definitely not a deal breaker, but it was pretty surprising when the game would pause in the middle of playing. And I think it just comes part and parcel with such a small and somewhat cramped device like this. Now on the bottom we have our mono speaker, then our USB-C input, and our headphone jack. So let's go ahead and do a quick audio test right here at max volume. And I think the audio quality here is surprisingly good. It's nice and rich, and the volume definitely gets loud. So despite the fact that it's bottom firing and mono, I think the audio quality here is fairly good. Okay, on the left side we have our volume buttons up and down, and then below that we have our single SD card. And my card did come preloaded with sample games, but I think most of these will come without any games loaded up. Next, on the right side, we have our menu button up top, then below that we have a small and kind of thin power button, and below that we have our rather large LED light. Let me show you what it looks like when it's turned on, and yeah, it is pretty distracting on a device so small. To give you a better idea, I'm going to turn off the studio light so it's pitch black so you can see exactly how bright it is. And as you can see, even when just playing, the light will reflect against your fingers, and the LEDs themselves are so bright they kind of match the screen brightness. Now charging the device, you'll get a small LED indicator that's red, and of note this is with a standard USB-A to USB-C cable. One thing I was surprised to find is that my USB-C to C cable actually worked fine, and this is plugged into a power delivery 45-watt plug. So at least based on my initial testing, chances are that any cable is going to work and charge this device, which is kind of rare with some of these handhelds. Okay, on the back we have a ribbed design on the bottom, then a Pixel logo up top, and there's also 2 small holes for a lanyard if you wanted to add that. And finally up top we have our shoulder and trigger buttons. Now these are actually flush with the case and they're micro switch connections, so they're a little bit clicky, and as you can see here the travel is very shallow. And honestly I think this is probably the right way to go when it comes to shoulders and triggers. It makes the device a lot more pocketable because it's so flush, and honestly most of the games that you're going to be playing do not have a shoulder and trigger function anyway. So it's nice that these buttons are here and that they don't take up a lot of space. Okay, next let's talk about the screen, and we're going to start with the screen dimness and brightness. And I found that the ratio between the two is not that significant. At the lowest brightness, I think it's a little bit too bright to play in the dark, and I think the very brightest setting is not going to be great in direct sunlight. So really this is going to be a device that you're probably going to want to play indoors for the most part. Another thing I noticed, at max brightness when using a black background, there is quite a bit of banding or light bleed around the edges. It's kind of hard to see in my footage, but if this is something that bothers you where you have uneven lighting on the screen, this is definitely happening on this device. But that being said, it's only very prominent when at max brightness with a black background. In a standard gameplay scenario, it's not really something that I could notice at all. Now another thing worth mentioning, because it's a 240p resolution, that means that scaling is not going to be the best for certain systems. For example, here's the size of a Game Boy screen when integer scaled. All this really means is that when you scale it up to fill out the entire screen, you will get a little bit of pixel distortion, so the pixels are not going to be super crunchy and square, and so if anything, it's just really not going to be as crisp and clear as a higher resolution screen. Now, given the fact that this display is only 2.4 inches altogether, it's not a huge deal for me, but if you are a pixel purist, I don't think this is going to be the ideal device. Either way, I found it most prominent when trying to play Game Boy and Game Boy Advance. When it comes to playing Super Nintendo and Nintendo, or even something that's scaled perfectly to 240p like PlayStation 1, it's actually a pretty nice experience. And I also think the colors are well balanced and saturated too, so no big complaints about the screen other than the fact that it's pretty small and the scaling is not great. But I think when it comes to most retro gaming, it'll be just fine. Next, I want to talk about the size and feel of the device. And one of the things I really had to get used to with this device is just how boxy and squarish it feels. Especially given the fact that this is a metal device, it's a little bit sharp around the edges on your hands. It's not the end of the world and definitely something that I adjusted to, but I would say the GKD Pixel is not a device I would want to play for hours on end. But I don't really think that's the purpose of this device. It's more of a pick up and play pocketable device that you can just knock out a few minutes here and there. And that is definitely one of its main strengths, the fact that you can just throw it in your pocket and take it around. It makes me more apt to actually use it. However, there are a couple caveats that I noticed in my week of testing, so let's go over those real quick. Number one, it feels like the glass on the screen is just not very thick. For example, when I press down on the screen and move my finger around, I'm easily distorting the image. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing this on your device at all, but I just wanted to demonstrate why I think the screen just feels a little bit fragile. I think if the glass was a little bit thicker, it would be less of an issue. And even though I think the device is pocketable, I would not recommend putting it in the same pocket as your keys. Again, I don't recommend doing this, but I took a key and then scratched the back of the device. And with very little effort, I was able to scratch the paint right off. So if anything, I would say if you do plan on pocketing this device, don't put it in the same pocket as keys because you may encounter an issue like this. Personally, over the past week, I've been using this little case right here, and this is from a company called Waterfield out of San Francisco, and it's called a micro wallet. And you have a couple different materials to choose from. The one I'm using is called wax canvas, and it's $25, but these folks make some pretty fancy stuff, so if you want to go even fancier with a leather case, it's about $39 altogether. That's a little bit rich for my blood considering the fact that this is an $80 or $90 device, but it is kind of cool as well. And the nice thing about this micro wallet is that it has space for the GKD Pixel and some other stuff. So for example, you could actually use it for wallet things like putting in a couple credit cards, your ID, or even a few dollars cash would fit in here no problem as well. And so I think that's kind of a neat concept, the ability to put all this stuff in a little wallet like this, and your wallet can also play video games. Anyway, if you want to pick one of these up, I'll leave a link down below. It is pretty handy. Now, like I mentioned in the intro, there is a big audience for micro handhelds like this. And a lot of the questions I've been seeing around the internet have to do with its overall size relative to other devices. So in service to all of those other people who are crazy about micro handhelds, here is just a smattering of some of the really small ones that I have here at the house. And initially I was going to do a whole deep dive comparing each of these against the other and talking about each of them one by one, but I realized that would probably make this video an hour long. And honestly, those who know about these devices probably know everything about them already, and on this channel I have reviews for most of these, other than the Playdate and the Pocket Go version 1. Either way, if you are into these smaller handhelds, here's a size comparison between the GKD Pixel and the others around it. And if you want to go into a deeper dive, I would recommend checking out retrosizer.com. This website has a ton of different handhelds available for comparison, including first-party stuff like the Nintendo DS and so on. Now, the GKD Pixel is not on the website just yet, but it will give you an idea of how these all compare against one another, and then hopefully this image will kind of round that all out for you. To give you a more practical example, I found that the best comparison with just a standard car key fob. And as you can see, the GKD Pixel is probably maybe 25% larger than that. So if you're comfortable putting a key fob with keys attached to it in your pocket, then putting the GKD Pixel in your pocket is going to be a very similar experience. Now, in terms of weight, this device is 107 grams. That's going to be pretty hefty in the hands given its relative size, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that it has an aluminum shell. Now, you can definitely find micro handhelds that are going to be both smaller and lighter. Something like the Funkey S as well as the Anbernic RG Nano are great examples. However, bear in mind that I do find these devices to be a little bit too small to actually use on a day-to-day basis. So let's compare it against other devices that I have used in the past as a daily driver. And we'll start at the most lightweight and work our way up, starting with the MinUI Smart. And this one's about 8 grams lighter, so very similar. Additionally, the original MinUI Mini is about the same weight as the GKD Pixel. And you can definitely find devices that are heavier and larger, including the Anbernic RG280V, and then also the MinUI Mini Plus and the Anbernic RG35XX Plus. So in the end, in terms of size and weight, I think the GKD Pixel is a great balance. There are definitely devices that are smaller than it, and I find those to be unplayably small, and there are definitely devices that are larger as well. But it does kind of share a Goldilocks space when it comes to micro handhelds. If the RG Nano is too small for you, then the GKD Pixel might be a good fit, and if you're willing to go a little bit smaller than the original MinUI Mini, this might be a good case as well. And like I mentioned before, I do consider this to be a pick up and play device, not something that I would play for maybe more than 20 minutes, but if you happen to have it in your pocket and you're just kind of stuck in line at maybe Jiffy Lube, this might be something that you can play in a smaller burst. The size also lends itself well to one-handed gaming, so if you want to knock out a couple RPGs like a Pokemon game or something like that, this is going to be a good fit for that as well. Now, if I had a choice between this one and the original MinUI Mini, I think I would probably still pick the original MinUI Mini, although this one does have its strengths and weaknesses. In terms of strengths, we got quite a few different software options available, but the original MinUI Mini is also a lot more fragile than the GKD Pixel. In addition, it's kind of hard to get your hands on an original MinUI Mini. These have been out of stock for quite some time, although they do have new drops every once in a while. And another micro device worth considering is going to be the MinUI Smart. This will come as no surprise for those who follow this channel closely, but this is my favorite micro handheld. Not only is it surprisingly sturdy, but it's also horizontal, which means it's going to be more comfortable to hold in the hands. It's not going to feel quite as cramped. So I think in terms of just micro console daily driver, the MinUI Smart is still the one to beat. And it also doesn't hurt that this one has has custom firmware as well using MinUI. We'll talk about that more later in this video. Now, if you're also willing to go a little bit larger in size, you can find some devices that are not quite micro, but also still small. And these devices include the MiU Mini Plus on the right, and then the Anbernic RG35XX Plus on the left. Both of these devices are about twice the size of the GKD Pixel, so it's not really a good size comparison. But if you are still looking for a device that's a little bit on the small size, but still pocketable, I think that the MiU Mini Plus is probably my favorite pick among these. And I made a ton of videos about this device, reviews, software updates, and even guides to help you get the most out of this one. So when it really comes down to it, it's all about size. If you want something that's really small and pocketable like the GKD Pixel, then yes, I think it's a very good size. But if you're willing to increase the size, you will get a lot more creature comforts, including better controls and ergonomics, and then also Wi-Fi. Anyway, I think that's enough when it comes to hardware and comparisons. Now let's move over to the software and performance. We're going to start with the stock operating system to give you a feel of what that experience is going to be like. And the stock operating system is called IUX. This is a closed source Linux firmware. And the interface for IUX is pretty old school. You've got a couple different options to choose from. To start, we have a bunch of standalone emulators. Within here, you can navigate through the various apps, and then you can press A to navigate through the games list and then choose your game to start with that app. And this is very similar to the other Linux-based firmwares that were available on various devices about 3 or 4 years ago, so nothing's really changed here. Anyway, once we start up a Game Boy game, we can see there are a couple configuration things that will need to be adjusted. First and foremost, the scaling is full screen, so it's taking up a 4:3 display even though this is a Game Boy game, which means it should run in 10:9. To get into the menu, it's pretty easy. You just press the menu button and you can see we have a standalone version of Gambate. And if you've ever used one of these older Linux-based devices, you probably are familiar with this menu. Either way, within here you can adjust your scaling and aspect ratio as well as your colorization. So you can dial in the experience after you go through the settings. One thing you may notice is there's a little bit of a checkerboard kind of scaling on the screen, and that actually has to do with the focus on my camera. So to the naked eye, it actually looks fine. So even though the screen looks a little bit garbled like this, it's actually a lot better when you're playing it in person. Now, generally, the standalone emulators are going to give you the best performance, but they also do have RetroArch cores available if you want to try those out with certain systems. But bear in mind that the performance as well as the scaling seems to be a lot worse in RetroArch than it was with the standalone emulators. For example, when playing with the RetroArch core, Game Boy does play at the correct aspect ratio, but I'm also seeing a lot of screen tearing and also pixel imbalance, and so this scaling is not very good. So for the most part, if you are going to use the stock operating system, I would recommend sticking with the standalone emulators. It's not going to give you a universal experience like it would with RetroArch, but I did find that the performance and scaling options were quite a bit better on the standalone emulators across the board. Now, to give you an idea in terms of performance, I did find that most systems played just fine on the stock operating system. And in terms of the overall user experience, I did find the stock operating system to be okay, but not that great. I think for newcomers, it might be a little bit intimidating to try to jump into various emulators and cores to see which one works best. And because most of the configurations are not optimized for this device out of the box, you will have to get into the settings to make some adjustments here and there. So I would say it's definitely not a seamless experience. And it can also be exacerbated by the type of game that you want to play. In particular, arcade games were pretty confusing. There were like 5 or 6 different ways that you can play various games. And so if you're not familiar with the various versions of Final Burn Alpha, Final Burn Neo, and MAME to get set up with arcade games, this can be pretty intimidating. However, I did find that playing arcade games on this little device was pretty cool. I love the idea of having something just super pocketable but being able to play a bunch of arcade classics. I think when it comes to the pick up and play spirit of the GKD Pixel, arcade games are a really good match. These are exactly the type of game that I want to play for maybe 5 or 10 minutes here and there. And then finally, one other thing worth noting is that PlayStation performance was pretty good on this device overall. Most of your standard games are going to play at a full frame rate, absolutely no problem, but I did find that frame skipping was a necessary function of some of the higher end PlayStation games like Bloody Roar 2. So I would say the gameplay here is relatively smooth, but imperfect if you're looking for accurate emulation. And going back to that whole one-handed gameplay thing, I found that PlayStation role-playing games were a really good fit for this device as well. In addition, I found that there were a bunch of standalone games and ports preloaded on here as well. Many of these are from older Linux builds, but if you do want to play some of these old classics, they are available. And finally, the last thing to note about the stock IUX operating system is that the interface is not ideal. For example, it does not have a working sleep function, and then also you cannot just press the power button to turn it off. you do have to go into the menu and manually shut it down every time like an old computer. So I do think there is room for improvement with the stock experience. Now thankfully, a community developer has already been working on it. In fact, there's a version of MinUI that's in alpha stage right now. And this is an operating system I've talked about a lot before with various handhelds. I think it's a very simple setup that works really well with smaller devices like this one in particular. And in talking with the developer over the past week or so in my testing, it does look like a public build will be available for everybody once this device starts shipping. Either way, because I got my hands on an early build, I do want to show you what the experience is going to be like on the GKD Pixel. And like I mentioned before, it's a very simple interface. Everything's going to be text-based, and it's going to be all pre-configured. So all you have to do is just pick your system, pick your game, and then launch it from there. And the developer also spends a lot of time and attention to detail to things like upscaling and aspect ratio. So all that's going to be pre-configured and optimized for MinUI. And because it has such a low overhead, it's going to be really snappy. So exiting out of a game is as simple as pressing the menu button and going to quit, and almost immediately you'll be back in the games list. Same thing with starting up a game. You just press it, and then within a couple seconds, it'll be booted right up. And again, all of this lends itself to that pick up and play experience of the GKD Pixel, and I think MinUI really enhances that idea. There's a couple other MinUI features that are worth mentioning as well. For example, if you press and hold the power button while in a game, it will actually power down safely. And on top of that, it's actually going to save the progress in your game before it shuts down. Now, the next time that you start it up, it's going to go right back to where you were before. So this will be really great if you want to focus on just one game at a time. Additionally, MinUI does have a working sleep function. You just tap on the power button to put it to sleep, and then tap on it again to wake it back up. And then finally, another great feature of MinUI is that it does have a robust options menu if you want to use it. So by pressing the menu button, you can save and load a state, and then also there is a universal options menu as well. Here you can do things like adjusting the aspect ratio or scaling if you'd like, and you've also got a robust feature set when it comes to game options for each emulator core. In addition, there are some other universal options. For example, you can change out the controls however you would like, and you can do the same thing with hotkeys or shortcuts. So that's one of my favorite things about MinUI, is that it is a very simple interface, but it gives you all the tools that you would need to configure it the way you want. So I'm going to do another quick run through all the various systems so you can see how they're going to play on MinUI on the GKD Pixel. When it comes to gameplay, I think this is one of the best fits for this device, and you have a bunch of different colorization options to choose from as well. Game Boy Color is also a similarly optimized experience. The aspect ratio is going to be pre-configured and everything's going to look good. And same thing with Neo Geo Pocket Color. This is also another system that stands out on the GKD Pixel. And a lot of these handheld systems are ideal for the smaller 2.4-inch screen on this device. And that's because these games were made with a smaller screen in mind, so the text is going to be bigger and easier to read. Game Boy Advance also plays surprisingly well. In terms of performance, I didn't find any games that had any sort of tangible slowdown. There was a tiny bit of audio crackling here and there for certain games, but I still would consider basically everything to be playable. However, when it comes to home consoles, it was a bit of a mixed bag. To start, the lighter systems like NES had absolutely no problem, everything was playing just fine. And same thing with these Sega systems, these are relatively easy to emulate, and so Sega Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X played just great. And it was the same experience with TurboGrafx 16 or PC Engine, as well as the CD variant of this console as well. However, I did find that there were a couple consoles that did cause some issues here and there. To start, I would say that Super Nintendo played mostly well. I would say that maybe 90% of games had absolutely no problem, but some of those top tier games were not optimal. For example, Super Mario RPG did give me a crackle here and there, but I would still consider it to be playable. And Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island had a little bit more crackling and a little bit of slowdown as well. So I think if you are a Yoshi's Island purist, you probably aren't going to enjoy the experience, at least right now on MinUI. And there were a couple games that had some tangible slowdown, especially Model 6 games like Star Fox. And so let's play a little bit of the audio to give you an idea of that experience. So it's definitely not a flawless Super Nintendo experience on this early build of MinUI on the GKD Pixel. And adding frame skip to the Super Nintendo core did not overcome these issues. It was also a similar experience with PlayStation 1. In fact, for most of these, I did just turn on the frame skip function, and I would say about half the games played absolutely no problem. So I think when it comes to lighter titles, things like racing or role-playing games, those were pretty good. But for those that were a little bit more 3D based or graphically intense, I definitely had some issues. Let me give you an audio sample here of Tony Hawk 2 to give you an idea. And of course, at the very top tier of games, things like Tekken 3 or Bloody Roar 2, these were definitely unplayably slow. You can see just from the footage alone that it's not playing at full speed. So I would say at least now, unless MinUI gets more optimized for this particular chipset, you may have to manage your expectations when it comes to Super Nintendo and PlayStation 1. And then finally, one thing worth noting with MinUI, if you do plan on switching over, is that it has a little bit more limited emulator options. And this is actually done on purpose to keep it a very streamlined and simple experience. However, like I mentioned before, I did find that arcade games were one of the best fits for the GKD Pixel. And unfortunately, MinUI does not support arcade cores at this time. And of course, this is the same with any of the other devices that run MinUI, but for the GKD Pixel in particular, the absence of arcade titles on this device that plays arcades so well was something I definitely noticed. In fact, I delayed the release of this video review by a couple days because I wanted to tinker around and see if I could get them working myself. But unfortunately, I'm a little bit in over my head, and so any of the arcade cores that I tried just didn't work in MinUI. So hopefully this is something we'll see as a community solution if the GKD Pixel becomes a popular device. And really, all that's to say is that the MinUI user experience is so much better than the stock operating system that I still recommend it over that, but with just a couple caveats, including the lack of arcade cores and some performance issues with Super Nintendo and PlayStation 1. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the GKD Pixel. And as always, we're going to start with what I like. And I think number one is the fact that this device does feel mostly rugged. I love the fact that it's made out of metal and has a nice hefty feel to it, but it's also not overly heavy. It just feels really satisfying. I also like the tactile controls. They're a little bit on the loud side, but still very responsive. And as far as micro handhelds go, I think this is a perfect size. It is very pocketable. It's also pretty exciting that MinUI as an operating system experience is already available for this device, because I think it improves the user experience significantly, especially for a pick up and play sort of device like the GKD Pixel. And finally, I think there's no question about it, this is a really good looking device. I like the fact that we have multiple colorways and it's a very classic design. Now, of course, this device, like with others, is not perfect, so let's talk about some of the things I don't like about it. Number one, even though the device feels mostly rugged, the screen does feel like the weak spot. Of all the things that would probably break on this device, I think that's the one that's going to be the first to go. Also, by virtue of the fact that it is a pretty squarish design and a small handheld, it does feel relatively boxy and cramped. And so it's not a device I would recommend playing for longer than something like 30 minutes. Additionally, if you really try to push the performance, like trying to play some of those harder Super Nintendo or PlayStation 1 games, the device does get a little bit warm. And this is probably attributed to the fact that it's a metal handheld. It never got to the point where it was uncomfortable, but it was something that I noticed. I also think the price for this, at least for now, is a little bit on the high side. $90 for a handheld that struggles to play every PlayStation 1 and Super Nintendo game is a little bit on the boutique side. However, there is some silver lining to this. GKD is working to get this device released on AliExpress, and I think the competition will drive down prices. In fact, it's one of the priorities that they have, at least according to this tweet. And then finally, the other thing worth noting is that there's no perfect software solution just yet. The user interface on the stock operating system leaves a lot to be desired, but it does give you a wide range of emulator options and better performance. Meanwhile, MinUI fixes all of the user experience issues, but at least in my initial testing, it took some hits in performance, and then also not every emulator core that I would like to play on this device was available. However, there's also a silver lining here. GKD is working to make this device open source. And if you know anything about the history of GKD, this is quite a big revelation. This company's been around for about 4 or 5 years at this point, and they are notorious for having closed source software. So the fact that they are willing to open source this device does mean that we may have some better optimizations for custom firmwares in the future. So in the end, I do think this device is a little bit in a wait and see kind of predicament. And that does make it a little bit hard for me to recommend here and now. As it stands right now, I think the device is expensive and the software is limited, but who knows, in 6 months it might be a much better experience all around. Even then, I can say that with MinUI, it does really improve the user experience, and I had a lot of fun testing this device over the past week. There's definitely still some rough spots around the edges, but overall, I walked away from this GKD Pixel review more impressed than I thought I would be. So if anything, I would say the device right now is very solid, and it has potential to be even better. So in summary, here's the way I see it. If you're looking for a very small micro handheld, you want something in a vertical form factor and metal, then I think the GKD Pixel does check off all of those boxes. And if you are into micro handhelds, the size here is a really good balance. It's not so small that it's unplayable, but it's also small enough to be able to play one-handed. However, among all the decent micro handhelds that we have available right now, I still think that the MinUI Smart is the safest bet. It's a lot easier to get your hands on this device compared to something like the original MiUI Mini, and it can also be loaded with an optimized version of MinUI. And because it's a horizontal handheld, I find it to be a lot more comfortable and ergonomic to use compared to a vertical handheld like the GKD Pixel. So if you want to learn more about this one, I'll leave a video link down below where I talk about why I like the MinUI Smart so much. That being said, if you like the look of the GKD Pixel, you like the fact that it maybe reminds me of an old Game Boy, or if you prefer a metal device because it's just more rugged and premium feeling, then I do recommend the GKD Pixel. There's a lot of reasons why I think this is a good handheld. And if anything, I've learned that when it comes to micro handhelds, personal preference really prevails over anything else. And so even though I love the MinUI Smart, and many people love the original MiUI Mini, I think that there will be a growing fan base for the GKD Pixel as well. As it stands, it gets a lot more things right than it gets wrong, and it's easily the best GKD device that they've released to date. So if you're ready to pick one up and you don't mind that higher price tag, then yeah, I think you'll have a lot of fun with it. However, if you're willing to wait a little bit longer to see if the price drops or we get better software options, it might be even better than it is right now. So let me know what you think about the GKD Pixel. Is it aligning to your tastes, or do you think there's something better out there for you? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.